Hey guys, I'm back today with another watercolor tutorial for you. This is Lilacs in a Jar with a Bee, and I had done these previous two paintings of lilacs with jars, and I kind of wanted to combine the best parts of them that I liked. And I'm going to go ahead and sketch out my jar and use this as my reference photo. I'm using some Prismacolor watercolor pencils just to sketch out my jar shape. And I'm also going to just sketch, I drew in a couple of the stems and I just want to sketch in this little bee. And I'm just going to use my previous one as just a reference of how I drew that last time. Just drawing that in a yellow watercolor pencil just to give myself a rough sketch of where I want that bee to be. Oh, and before I forget here, I wanted to mention that the paper I'm using here is an Arches watercolor paper block in the rough texture, and it's a size 8 by 10. And I'm just going to wet my paper down so I can do my background. I just want to do kind of a muted pastel colored background using the colors that I'm going to be using in my painting. So I wet that down with just some clean water from a spray bottle, and I'm spreading that water out evenly just to eliminate any puddles, make sure I have a nice even coat of water on my paper. And I'm using a Princeton Velvetouch 1/2 inch wash brush just to spread that out. And I'm going to get some of my colors on my palette here. I'm using Daniel Smith watercolors, and the first one I am getting out is the Carbazole Violet and then Quinacridone Rose. Those are two of the colors I'm going to use just for my flowers, and then I'm getting some sap green and then some of this Phthalo turquoise. So those will be the four main colors I'm going to use. And I'm just going to put some of that in the background and just spread that out to get a nice even looking background. I'm going to put more of the blue colors along the bottom because I'm going to be using blue in my jar, and I'll put more of the violet and rose color up near the top half of the paper because that's where my flowers will be. And this way I'll just get a nice soft looking background, and just make sure I'm adding water to my brush and spreading that around so that I don't have any pooling and end up with any blooms on my paper. One nice thing about using this rough textured paper for something like this is it does give you a little bit of a better background, in my opinion, just that I don't end up with lots of little pooled spots of water as much, and it just gives a nice looking texture and interesting element to the piece. And here I'm just going to add in a little of the violet and just spread that around so that I get a nice even background. And I'm going to go ahead while this is a little wet right here and put my stems in, the ones that are inside the jar, just to give them a little bit of a fuzzy look because they are in the water. And then I will probably just do some layers over this after it dries just to give a little more detail. But I just wanted to kind of put those in now of where my stems are going to be. This will also help me give me a little bit of a guide of where I'm going to put my flowers in the top of the jar. And here I'm just going to put in a few loose little leaf shapes using my flat brush still. And then actually I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my round brush. This is a Princeton Velvetouch round size 10. And I'm just going to add some some of the background for my jar. I just want to do just a little bit of a background wash, and I will be adding some other layers on top of this. So I just wanted to do my initial layer on here and then wet my brush and just kind of blend that in just to give myself the basic outline of the jar. And then just doing some curved lines and some detail lines along the middle that'll be a little bit fuzzy just to show the curve and the glass. And then I'll fill in on the bottom to show where the bottom of the jar is from the inside. So that'll be a little bit darker as well. I'm just adding a little bit of detail lines vertically and then some curved horizontal lines just to show the curve of the jar. And then just blending in with some extra water here just to blend that out and adding a little bit more. All right, so before I move on any further, I just want to make sure that was all the way dry. Just adding in, I had some white space along the bottom there. I just wanted to add a little bit more of my blue and just making sure that's really dry before I do my next layer over the top because I don't want this next layer to bleed into the background. I want it to be nice and crisp. All right, so for my first layer of my lilacs, I want to take that rose and the violet and make just kind of a more of a red violet color for my first layer of my flowers. And I'm using my round brush and I'm just going to kind of um, tap it down onto the paper and just make kind of in an oval shape and just leaving space in between. So we'll do a couple different layers, and this is just the first, just very lightly. I don't want it to be too dark here, so this is just my initial wash underneath. This will be the background of where the flowers are, and just leave some white space in between, and just tap the brush down until I get those elongated oval shapes of what the lilacs would be. right? And just filling in a few more little spots, and then I will dry this layer. And if you need some help, maybe getting an idea of what direction you should put these, it was nice to go back and look at my reference photo just to kind of get an idea of what direction I wanted those to go. All right, and just making sure that layer is nice and dry before I do my next layer over the top. All right, so for the next layer, I'm just going to do another mix of this, but I just want it to be a little bit more on the red violet side, and I needed a little bit more of those two colors on my palette, so I'm just going to mix that together again. This one, I guess I'll go a little bit more on the violet side this time, and just still in that red violet, but mixing that together just to be a little bit darker than the last layer. And then I'll just go back over in the same way I just did and maybe variate where I'm putting it and curve my brush a little bit, make maybe little circly shapes, and then dab and make little circles and just mix it up so that I have some variation in my petal size. And then again, I will go over this one more time after this layer. So just do this whole bunch, copying over where you went, just varying up what your petals are on this. Okay, and get that layer all dry again, and then we can add our third layer over the top once that is dry. Right, so I'm just mixing in a little bit more of the violet to give that a little bit of a darker color, and I'll just go back over each one and doing the small little circular shapes and dabbing it in just to give some variation in texture and shape, and leaving a little bit of white space here and there and letting the colors from underneath show through. So I'll go back over each one of my flower stalks and maybe vary the shade of purple just slightly between them just to separate them out. And then I'll just go over each one and then we'll let that layer dry. All right, here I'm just getting some of my paint ready to do my leaves and my stems, getting some sap green. And then actually I'm going to go ahead and do the inside of my jar next. And I'm going to do a mixture of burnt sienna light with a little bit of ultramarine just to give myself a nice gray blue color. And then I can add a background wash over the jar to represent the water inside. So I'll just kind of pick that water line there and then getting my brush nice and wet and just blend that out. And then I'm going to go ahead and dry that layer. Okay, now that that's dry, I'm going to go ahead back over my jar and just add a little bit more details with that Phthalo turquoise. Just going to go ahead on those same lines I did the first time, just kind of do the outline of my jar and do a little bit more to define that jar edges. All right, so now I can go back in, now that that's a little more dry, and I can do a little bit more detail on my stems that are coming into the water. Just above the water line, they'd be a little bit darker. I'm gonna have a branch of leaves coming up here. So going back over where I did on my background before, I'm gonna add those leaves there. I'm just using my round brush, starting out at the point and then pressing my brush down and then lifting it again to come back to a point. This might be something you want to practice on a separate sheet just to make sure that you get the leaf shape that you desire. And then I'm going to draw, or excuse me, I'm just going to paint a few leaves coming out from the sides and a few little stem lines coming in between the flowers. I have one leaf just coming over the edge of the jar there. And this is just where you can use your creative license, I guess, and just kind of put it in any of the empty spots or a place that you feel like just needs something filled in. You can add greenery and leaves or another branch coming up. If you have some big white spaces in between some of your flowers, you could use that spot to put in a small little stem coming through the flowers. I'm just going to add a couple more leaves over here. And then over here, where my bee is going to be, I'm just going to put another little leaf and stem right there as well. And I'm just adding some small, very thin lines in between some of my flowers just for like little stems or the petals and what would be coming in the middle of the lilac stalks. And just darken my branches or stems coming in, and they'll be a little bit thicker looking. I'm just going to darken that, add a little burnt umber to it just to darken those up. Because lilacs actually do have very woody stalks, so they're not always bright green. And then you wanted to make sure where the lip of your jar would be, you wouldn't really see the stems as much. So I'm not making those very defined right there because they would be, you wouldn't be able to see them very clearly through the edge of the jar. All right, and I am going to switch to a size 1 brush for this bee. All right, so now that I got my jar of lilacs pretty much finished, I'm going to go ahead and work on the bee. And here I am using some Hansa Yellow Light, and I did mix a tiny bit of the deep with that just to get a nice yellow color that's not quite too bright. And I'm just going to lay just a wash over the main body of the bee. And then I'll do all of my details over the top with some black, which I'm actually using a Magello Mission Gold Black because I don't have a black in my Daniel Smith colors, and I just couldn't quite get the desired dark black color by mixing other colors. So some people are purists and they say never use black, but I actually end up using it quite a bit because maybe out of laziness of not wanting to mix my own black, and it's just a nice convenient way to do some details if you're doing more illustrative work. So I want to make sure I dry that yellow all the way before I do any of my detail work in black over the top. Okay, and if you want to just take a look at some reference rows of bees on this, I'm just doing very small little strokes to kind of give it a little bit of a hairy texture. And his point comes out to a point on the bottom for his stinger. And then I'll add like little legs in there and a little stripe, just going back and forth in small little strokes to give that hairy look. And then when I'm going to do the head, I'm actually drawing a small circle of where I want the eye to be because I want to leave a small line of white just inside the circle and then a small dot of white for the eye. So very carefully, you want to just go around that, and then I'm going to add in my hairy looking texture with small little strokes just to finish off the head, and then fill in the rest of that with the black. and add the antenna and the little legs. And then I'll do some small little outline details on the wings. All right, and that's my finished piece, or lilacs in a jar with a bumblebee. I hope that you enjoyed painting along with me. If you want to share your painting, I'd love to see it. You can tag me on Instagram, Mrs. Handpainted, or use my hashtag Mrs. Handpainted. And if you like my video, give it a thumbs up here on YouTube. Subscribe to my channel. I'm adding new tutorials all the time. And thanks for watching.